In this video, I'd like to introduce a new module for Planet Dance. It's based on the work of Gouchon and Barbault, who were both great mundane astrologers in the last century. Barbault lived until very recently, and it's only that some of his best work has been published in English in the last few years. The module allows you to look at long-term mundane cycles using the planets Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune and Pluto. The work is based on the efforts of Gouchon, who worked during the early part of the 20th century, and Barbault's development of Gouchon's work in the latter part of the last century and the early part of this century. You can find the module in Time, Tools, Gouchon, Barbault, Mundane Cycles. This will bring up the main window for the cycles analysis, and when you first open this script you will see this screen. This is the classic Barbault curve for mundane cycles over the course of a century from the 21st of March 2000 for the following 100 years. Each division represents 1 year, and then these subdivisions represent a decade or 10 years. This script is designed for mundane astrologers to look at long-term cycles formed by the aspect relationships or the phase relationships between the planets Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, Saturn and Jupiter. These phase differences, which are calculated once a year for each of the 10 pairs of planets, give rise to this rising and falling curve. You can also display a second curve that was developed by Barbault in his latter work. This looks at the annual rise and fall of the phase differences from 1 year to the next. And again you see this falling, rising graph. This line here is the sum of the differences in the phase relationships between the 5 planets, Jupiter through Pluto. You can also display the curve for Saturn through Pluto and through Uranus to Pluto. These curves give rise to this curve which appears at the top of the graph with the addition of Jupiter. It's Jupiter's motion, which is the fastest moving of all of these planets, that gives rise to the steep rise and fall of this curve at certain points in the century. These curves can be switched on and off as you wish, and you can also display other data, for example the line of moving average for all of the planets, Jupiter through Pluto. This pink or rose-coloured line evens out the more acute rises and falls over a 10-year period and displays a smoother line, a smoother curve. The rise and fall line can also be displayed with a 10-year moving average to help you see the overall trends over a period of time, for example a decade or a couple of decades. You also have some other display options. You can look at where there are periods of years where there is a hard aspect emphasis. So in this coming century you can see there's 2 years where there's a heavy emphasis on hard aspects, and that means 6 or more of the aspect pairs are at that point in a hard aspect relationship. You can also display the soft aspect emphasis, so you can see in the latter part of this decade and the early part of the coming decade there is a preponderance of soft aspects. These are degree based, but if we switch those off you can also look at sign based emphases as well. The final 2 emphasis lines show the waxing emphasis, so this is where a preponderance of the planets are in a waxing phase relationship with each other, and you can also show the waning emphasis here. And you can note that in the recent years from 2016 through to 2020 there's been a heavy emphasis on waning aspects, and again this means generally more than 50% of the aspect relationships formed in each of those years are waning aspects. Waning aspects, as you can see, are associated with steep falls in the curves, and if we look at waxing emphasis you can see that the waxing emphasis leads to rises in the curves. You can calculate the positions either heliocentrically or geocentrically, but you can see that there's very little difference in terms of the overall shape of the curves between the two. I believe André Barbault recommended the use of the heliocentric positions, but either will give you basically the same data, which Barbault acknowledged. You can also display data. So there's a 100-year ephemeris showing the degree position and sign position of the planets on the calculation date, which is always the 21st of March in each year. So if we scroll down to this current year, you can see that on the 21st of March Jupiter was at 22 Capricorn, Saturn was at 29 Capricorn, Uranus was at 4 Taurus, Neptune at 18 Pisces, and Pluto at 24 Capricorn. There are other data tables. This is the angular difference each year, so you have the 10 planetary pairs and the angular difference between them. Minus sign means the aspect is waning, and a plus sign means the aspect is waxing or forming. You can also display specific aspects. These are aspects by sign. So if 2 planets are in a classic Ptolemaic aspect by sign, this table will show you their relationship. And you have degree based aspects here. The program is currently set to work with a 10 degree orb, In later versions of this, I'm aiming to make this user choice, but at the moment it's limited to a 10-degree orb. You can see the angular difference here. So this represents the blue line. So you can see in 2020, on the 21st of March, the sum total of the angular differences between the planets, 5 planets, was 516, and you can correlate that there with the position of the line here at around 516. You can also show the change, and there's emphasis given to rapid changes due to fall or rise. Green is a rising change and red is a falling change. Where periods of time or years where there's relatively little change are highlighted in yellow. Lastly, there are various graphs that you can look at. You can have a graph of aspect counts, sign-based, which shows you by decade how many waxing and how many waning aspects were formed. This is by sign, and you can do the same by degree based. You can also look at a graph for the rise and fall in the decade. You can see in this decade just past, there was a total rise due to waxing aspects of 154, but a falling a fall due to waning aspects of 368, and this gives rise to this steep curve in the latter part of the decade. There's other ways of showing this data. You have waxing and waning cycles, so you can see for any particular year, is there a preponderance of waxing or waning cycles? And you can see again in the latter part of the recent decade just gone, there was indeed a preponderance of waning aspects amongst the faster moving planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and the outers, transpersonal planets, particularly in the years 18 and 19. Finally, you can get a display that shows you when the hard and soft aspects by sign were formed or form, and also by degree. There's also a comprehensive help menu to assist you, and you can find a little bit of information here, some explanation of how these curves are generated, and also the weighted aspect scores for the weighted aspect graph. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation about the Gouchon Barbault Mundane Cycles Analysis module just introduced in Planet Dance.